Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm just going to do a little bit of introduction to the Polis project and what we do. Polis project is a global magazine of dissent, and we document communities in resistance at the intersection of art, culture, and politics. I just realized that next year, Polis would be turning 10. I have no idea where a decade went, but here we are. And in the last few years, we've really ventured into things we never thought possible. About 2 years ago, the brilliant Madhuri Shastri, who is a culture editor, came on board to build our culture vertical. Since then, we've been doing some incredible work. So all of you aspiring writers, thinkers, reviewers, find Madhuri, and you have my permission to harass her. We would love to hear from you. And again, thank you so much for being here. Public programming has always been the heart of Polis project, because we believe that if you're going to document communities in resistance, we gather community as much as possible. And this event, I've been manifesting and planning for over a year, so I'm so happy it's happening. And one of the reasons this event came together was because suddenly all of my students started quoting Democracy in America by Tocqueville. I don't know why that happened. And even as a graduate student, I've always felt very underwhelmed by the book. And I've always wondered, who gets to travel through America and who gets to opine, who gets to tell these stories? And I thought, who do I really want to hear from about America now? And the three names that came to me are all here. As I said, it took me a year to manifest this. And the conversation today really is asking that question: who gets to write about America in a time when ICE is pulling people off the street? The Supreme Court has, for all purposes, taken us back to a time where might as well be in the realm of segregation. Voting rights are being gutted. Violence against black and brown bodies is just increasing. And it feels like we have no option but to feel helpless and hopeless. And it's exactly at this time that we start asking people who are not hopeless, whose writing actually gives us hope. So that's why we have this conversation today. And also now I'm going to do a brief introduction. I'm going to do a brief introduction of all of these writers. And also the introduction is, I decided, is also going to come. Okay.
Setting the tone for the talk.
Mic drops, multiple mic drops and phone drops. So I'm going to briefly introduce, actually, I'm going to take a little bit more time and introduce all of our writers on the stage today. A decade ago, I got an email and a quick phone call from another very dear friend of mine, Bhakti Sringarpure, who said, Suchitra, you have to review this book. She didn't tell me who or what. She said, I need you to review this book by this young writer called Aruni Kashyap. The book arrived as a PDF, and that was 13 years ago when I first got to know Aruni through his words. And over these 13 years, I have not only seen Aruni go from the writer that I first reviewed many years ago to someone who's written multiple other books, works of fiction, non-fiction, 4 books of translation, and today he has another phenomenal American debut, his first American fiction debut, How to Date a Fanatic. So, Aruni, thank you for being here. Next, I was trying to figure out when do I know Anjali from. I couldn't put a date on it because I feel like I've known Anjali all my life, and that's not true because I knew Anjali again through 2 books that she wrote. And my conversations with Anjali have always been Anjali me learning from Anjali about what does it mean to be American? What does it mean to think about organizing people, organizing our communities, the heartache that comes from failing and still going on. Anjali has another book, The Ballot, which is now out, and she's on her book tour. And Anjali also worked on the Stacey Abrams and John Ossoff's campaigns. And again, absolute joy that you're here. Zara is someone that I've known in terms of time the shortest. But I also, after having, we had a phenomenal conversation with Zara last year at the Polis project about her book. And then I also found out that Zara and I are related.
That's right.
Through what one calls family, chosen family and friends. And then I go to my brother-in-law and he says, Zara's like a sister to me. How do you not know her? I said, I don't know. But again, I first encountered Zara through her book, The Lucky Ones, which is an incredible book, not only about bearing witness to the pogrom, but what it means to think and live with it through the past 20 years. But also what it means to reflect about it from here in the United States. So I am going to ask all of you to give a big round of applause to our writers. And now we're going to ask them to solve all the deep philosophical questions and angst and alienation that we have been dealing with. Today we're going to solve this problem. Okay, the first question is for all of you. So we are all living through this moment that is very difficult to name, let alone write about it. So what does it feel like to be a writer right now? And what is making sense to you and what isn't?
Hello. I think I turned it off. Hi. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Suchitra. Can we just give her a big round of applause for doing this? And to the Polis Project and the team here. I think we're all here because organizations like yours pull us together in very isolated times. So thank you for doing this amazing work. What does it feel like to be a writer right now? It feels like walking on coals while trying to juggle eggs and hoping that the eggs or you don't fry. And I'm saying this only because to have written a book about genocide and then go on tour under a genocide, and to recognize that I'm now in the belly of the empire that creates so many of these systems, I think my brain has sort of been in this whirlpool and just sort of, I don't know, I feel like I've come out on the other end of some sort of matrix. So it's been a transformative time, and I'm not sure what lies at the other end of it.
I couldn't have said it any better, probably. Beautiful metaphors and very appropriate ones. I feel that I'm obviously in an absurd apocalypse, and I don't know if it started in 2014 in India or if it was intensified in 2016 in the United States and has gone on a nosedive ever since. But at the same time, whenever I think of survival, I really think a lot about my own formative years in Assam, where in the 90s and the 80s, there was this massive insurgency and brutal counterinsurgency. People in my family were tortured and beaten up, and all kinds of horrible things happening to them. Me going to my grandmother's village and finding out people with guns coming to demand food, and next day the army would say, why did you give them food? But because you don't argue with people with guns. That's a simple reason. But what among all of this, in the middle of all of this, what I saw was repeatedly was literary organizations and artists attracting huge crowds. Maybe because it was a kind of hope for people. I mean, Assam Sahitya Sabha, it has many problems, but it was also an organization that attracted 500,000 people every 2 years to its biennial. And these are people who actually a lot of them are not literate, but they would go to listen to people reading poetry, reading a chapter from a novel. So I take always inspiration from that, which means is that despite all that is happening around us, the dumpster fire, we still have to go to work every day. Like those writers, and I think about those writers because those writers do not come from robust publishing locations and infrastructure. Those writers do not write for royalty. Those writers never, ever got an advance in their life. My parents are writers. They never, ever received a royalty check. My father's written 24 books. He has never received an advance. He has never received a royalty check because we come from very broken publishing infrastructures. But yet he keeps writing. Why? And he used to make his phone number available, and he used to be flooded with all kinds of horrible hatred, and he still used to take it on and still write his next op-ed, and he still continues to do that at 76. So I take inspiration from all these people, other writers, other artists, and realize that even though it sounds absurd, and it's an absurd apocalypse to me, I have to keep at it every day, because I have so much more than a lot of these people that I have known growing up, so I have to keep fighting.
Those are beautiful, beautiful stories. Thank you both for sharing them. I'll talk about something more recent. So I was born in the US and spent most of my childhood, half of my childhood in the South, the Deep South, Chattanooga, Tennessee, which was a very Bible Belt evangelical Christian, oppressively evangelical Christian community. And I've now been back in Georgia for 19 years. But there is when you live in the South for a long time, what you feel, what you grow up around is the Black resistance, right? We have the history of the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Movement, and more Black people live in the South than any other region in the United States. So there is this triumphant feeling of overcoming things, of learning resilience from activists in the past and the present that comes from very much the Black community. And so I've been sort of surrounded by that and discovered with my geography, soon discovered Black radical writers and artists and thinkers, from Angela Davis to June Jordan to James Baldwin, Audre Lorde. And so I wasn't a writer doing any of this, though. I was just a reader, feeling this sort of incredible admiration from these Black writers and thinkers, not really exposed at that age in my teenage years to South Asian writers. Not many were being published in the 1980s to begin with. I found myself to writing much later than most people do. And then when I did, it became imperative to me. But to address your question directly, Suchitra, which I think is such an important question, I'll share what was quite an identity crisis for me as a writer, which was in 2024. So my third book, Ballot, is about voting and voting rights in a very anti-voting climate. I signed the contract for that book in December of 2023. And it was due in the spring of 2025, which meant that I was spending 2024 writing it. And what I was focusing on was what happened in 2020, which was that Trump lost, and then he went completely into a rage at all of the swing states that he lost, which included Georgia, where I was living. So I was already active in anti-voter suppression work in Georgia for years before 2020. We had tried to get our Secretary of State recalled. That was a big movement. We lobbying a lot of our members of Congress. So that had already been going on long before 2020. But 2020, he basically encouraged Republican legislators in these swing states especially, but also in other red states, to pass voter suppression laws and to also create policies to make it very, very difficult to vote. So that was what inspired the book, and that's what I was writing towards. I had already been writing as a journalist, a freelance journalist, about voting and voting rights in the South. That was a passion of mine. And I'd also grown up, because I was informed by Black radical thinkers, I'd also grown up knowing that elections were another tool of US empire, right? There was no time where I had to sort of, I had this rose-colored glasses about what elections did. I always knew that it was a very corrupt two-party system, and voting for the lesser of two evils was not really going to do anything but put us in a circle. But there was something about what was happening in 2024. I was a member of the very active pro-Palestinian movement in Georgia, and the events of 2024 really broke me. The groups that I'm in, we were trying to meet with anybody that had any connection to the Biden administration, and then the Harris campaign. We were doing constant meetings with members of Congress, and what I found was that my book did not make sense to me anymore, and I almost broke the contract. I almost said, in this kind of climate where the very people that I had worked so hard to elect would not even return an email or a phone call. I had some of these people, I texted with them, and would block every opportunity for simply dialogue. This is what broke me. Not because I thought suddenly that Zionism and US democracy would end. It was that when you work for years to build relationships with people, you do not expect to agree on all the issues, but there usually is some kind of effort to have dialogue, and the dialogue was just gone. So I really had to ask myself, what is it like to write in democracy? Because right now I want to quit. I kept going simply because I didn't know what I would do if I didn't keep going. I didn't know how I would actually process anything that was happening. And then I started thinking about the good people that did exist, that were fighting the system. And that's what brought me back to the writing, was thinking about there are still great people fighting this, and isn't it kind of shameful and self-centering for me to pretend that we have not been in this moment before in this country, when of course we have. Look around, we are a country that has and still does enslave people. We come from a rich history of resistance movements and many different, racial groups, ethnic groups, religious groups. And so to, again, come back to the answer of your question is, I think writing democracy is really about using creativity to find solutions and to translate them into some kind of direct, concrete action.
Thank you. I really want to dig into that idea of living at the heart of the empire, and times when you feel so deeply distraught and hopeless, especially as you've talked about what's happening in Gaza. We've been bearing witness to a live stream genocide. There's protests. Nothing seems to have, it feels like nothing seems to have happened. So I kind of want all of you to kind of think a little bit more about that. How does this writing exist? Like, what do you do? What has been some of the things that you've been doing at this moment?
I think I use my classroom as a space that is liberating and hope, and a space of hope. Somewhere along the lines, I don't know when, I realized that it is my job to create more fiction writers, and more fiction writers in the vein of writers who I have admired. So what I do is make them read those writers. We talk about, we take it apart, put it back together. So, and having a graduate program, doctoral program in creative writing and leading it, constructing it has been very meaningful for me in the last 6 years at least. And creating a program where we talk about these things in the classroom repeatedly, where young writers, beginning writers are very committed to think and use fiction, poetry, and nonfiction as a mode of changing discourse in the society. So I go back to that space because I think that space, just like the space of writing fiction, is a very sovereign space. It is where I can assert my rules and parameters. In the same way, I find fiction as a very sovereign space. We have to work hard to keep those spaces sovereign, but at the same time, I think the contract, the unwritten contract, is that these are very autonomous, very sovereign space, and because of that, it is very fecund, and you can create new plants and plant new seeds in that soil.
Classrooms are sites of propaganda.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of propaganda, when I started to get on social media and see what Israel was doing, and then this constant, but senators and House representatives saying things like, but we have to keep the Iron Dome going, we have to keep the Iron Dome going. And I was just having a hard time sort of visualizing this thing as a structure, as a system, as a design. And then I had this thought one day, again, when I was in a classroom, and also just speaking to neighbors and people in my community, America lives under an iron dome of information. Mm-hmm. Yeah. In this country, there is such limited access to stories of the rest of the world, but also this very specifically, particularly designed cutoff point of this is where our empathy is going to end, because this is when we won't be able to be as self-serving as we need to be within this design, right? And I think once I understood that, I think the whole picture became a lot clearer for me of what does it mean to be in conversation with Americans right now, because I realized that it was like I was speaking gibberish. I was speaking another language at times, and they would look at me and be like, well, do you need water? Can we get you something? Because you look very upset. And it's like, you should be upset, and how is this not transferring? And so I think once I sat with that problem, I realized that it's a question of where they're getting their information from, how curated that information is, how beautifully these narratives are spun. And I'm a film girl, so for me, I was thinking about how many people have watched Gangs of Wasseypur here? Okay, all right, some. So there's this line in it, and pardon my Hindi, but it says that jab tak in Hindustan mein cinema rahega, log jute bante rahenge. And what it translates to is that till there is cinema in India, people will get screwed over. And I think that there's a larger point that is being made in lines like that, right? That you're saying it's not just news media. It's everything around you. It's public school education. It's what they pick in your history books. When I came here and learned that in California, they don't want them to teach caste when they talk about Hinduism, I was like, well, that's yet another chip in this Iron Dome, right? So we're looking at a structure where information itself has been designed only for the purpose to serve the empire. So my job then becomes, what are those creative ways to infiltrate this dome?
I love that. I'm going to take off from both of what you said, which I think is so important. Sometimes I have to remind myself that we actually don't have to put a crack in U.S. empire. We put a crack in the smaller units of U.S. empire, and when those individual things break, they then will bring the whole thing down. So smaller places like a classroom, smaller places like having a conversation with somebody where you are effectively able to cast doubt on what their propaganda is. And you know, what I also find is that sometimes we have to be the first people that do that, which is not necessarily fun or comfortable, but planting a seed of doubt in somebody through our writing or through conversations can be so much more effective than, you know, what I oftentimes do, which is rant on social media and think that, you know, that's going to be an effective way to sort of connect with someone, and it's not always effective way. But you know, smaller groups of people saying, "Oh no, that's the U.S. is actually the bad guys." Like you have a really sort of reverse thinking about good versus evil, about what really is democracy and what really isn't. You know, I think I started talking about fascism in the United States publicly on social media in probably 2014. And, you know, it was you know, I had a lot of journalists especially just really go to town in the comments about, you know, you don't know enough about what's happening internationally. I was like, we were founded on fascism. So, you know, conversations like that, which cast doubt on somebody's views, I think is a great place, whether it's sharing something somebody's written too, right? An article, an essay, some perspective. I think it can be very, very effective for shattering what people's entire identities are built on, which is, in this country, it is certainly U.S. imperialism, right? That's what, so many people have this love relationship with it. And saying, no, you're being scorned here. You are actually a victim of it, and here's what you need to be thinking about it.
Thank you all for that. And now I'm really going to go into each of the writers and like kind of link their work to the larger questions that we're answering. Zara, I'm going to start with you first. Sure. Okay. So Lucky Ones is asking the reader to kind of sit with the Gujarat pogrom, right? And when I was reading the book, one of the things that felt like one of the beautiful things about the book, Lucky Ones, if you haven't read it, is that it feels like Zara sitting next to you and she's speaking to you. It doesn't feel so distant, it feels like someone telling the story of what happened to them. And you say this from that intimacy, right? So about this, the way in which someone narrates a story, but only in this case you're narrating a genocide. You said that you kept asking yourself why you were writing this more than 20 years from later. So have you answered that question? Have you kind of found an answer for that?
Yeah, because I think so much of, especially working towards that first book, is about self-doubt and about, do I have the tools? Am I fully ready? Have I done everything possible to prep to be able to touch this topic or this project? And then also the sense that, you know, there's clearly big journalists who've covered it and people who've done investigative, like undercover reporting. There's all of this stuff. What do I have in this to offer anymore? And I think at some point in writing it, especially because I started by first writing about my father. And as I was writing, it was this chapter called Slow Violence. And Rob Nixon, who writes a lot about slow violence, had come to our campus. And he was explaining it in this like socio-political and environmental way. And what until then had just been a chapter about, you know, this public servant man goes every day to work, is chided and made fun of for being Muslim by his like Hindu Gujarati colleagues, comes back home, pours one whiskey, second, third, and then plates start to fly and chappals start to fly in the house, and what that did to us. And I was so focused in this way on my father that I had never zoomed out to recognize that this was part of a trickle, this was a system of violence that we were part of, and that the pogrom was really just this sort of grand spectacle. But what had been happening to us had been much longer. And when you sit with that as a connection, and again, because I'm like a design structure person, I like to see connection in what I'm writing. It became almost a sense of the only thing I have to offer, because there's people who've lost so much more. I mean, whether it's Ehsan Jafri, Bilkis Bano, Shabana and Suhana, who I name in the book. I mean, there's so many people who have heart-wrenching and sort of terrifying stories. And all I have is the memory of these stories traumatizing us, right? And so for me, it just became the fact that I can offer my family. I can offer us as an insight, because how else are you going to know what it means to live within a home that was already on fire, in a state that is on fire? And I think this was something I learned by studying the writings from the Shoah, from the Nakba. I learned from other writers because I've always been curious, and especially after 2002, I took classes and courses, and what does it mean to write from within? And how do you tap at the sort of burning rage of a teenager, right? Like you see Bisan right now. There's fire in her eyes, and there's a way in which she's delivering, which is both defiance and great despair. And she knows that they're alone. And I think to be able to tap into that sort of energy within oneself, it broke me on the page. But I think going town to town, meeting people, especially meeting folks after Trump got elected the second time, it was insane to realize that we're never actually moving ahead in time. It feels like time is moving through us, but we keep doing the same thing.
Thank you, Zara. I'm sorry, that was incredibly powerful. Thank you. In the vein of time moving through us, Aruni, your book is also in some ways time moving through people. In your first novel, The House of Thousand Stories, which is set against the armed insurgency in Assam, of course a conflict that most Americans, I would also say a conflict that most Indians and South Asians are not familiar with. Now you're writing, so that was your beginning. Now you're writing a novel that is set in the United States, between the United States and India. Now you've lived in this country for a while. So how has that taught you? How has it shaped this novel? Now as a writer who takes from the stories, the lived realities, and of course, now a different kind of, you're bearing witness to a very different kind of violence now, whether it's Georgia or just in the US. Tell us about that.
My short story collection has more stories set in the United States. This one is about a character, How to Date a Fanatic is about a character who moves back to India after doing his PhD. So there are some scenes in the US and some scenes in Assam, but predominantly the novel is set in around Delhi, and he's fallen in love and he's not loved back, and what happens as a result of that, exploring the queer dating circuit. You know, I have, as a literary artist, I have always, I think many people don't know that I actually wrote from my childhood till 2013 when my first novel came out only in Assamese. I did not ever write in English. So I was, and basically, I am and I was an Assamese writer. My early stories came out in Assamese. I wrote columns in Assamese. I wrote literary criticism in Assamese. It just happened that I wrote 4 novels in Assamese. Nobody published it. Then I thought, I'll write in English. And it got published. So then I thought, okay, somebody told me that you should do an MFA, and that's how it started. So as a result of that, one of the things that I found often was that the kind of aesthetics and the stylistics that I borrowed constantly from, inadvertently, was the vernacular aesthetics, was the Assamese novel, the Bengali novel, the Hindi novel, and I found myself in very much in opposition with a globe-trotting Indian novel, which was, when you are globe-trotting, you have to shed a lot of excess baggage. So what was that excess baggage was thought of as less valuable by the Indian novel in English. I thought it was valuable to me, and I wanted to globe-trot, as in I wanted to be read widely, but without shedding that excess baggage, in my own terms. So that was my site of resistance, that that I will resist against this Indian English novel, the Indian English conventions of the Indian English writing, but in my own terms, by borrowing repeatedly from the vernacular aesthetics, by borrowing repeatedly, in many ways, decentering whiteness, because eventually, who you are, this is a question about the audience, but eventually the Indian English novel is repeatedly centering whiteness, a Western reader constantly, but the Bengali novel, the Gujarati novel, the Hindi novel, the Tamil novel is not doing that. So for me, in a way to resist the empire was to resist the novel that served the empire. You know, you will read so many novels, Indian English novels, which are about the H-1B crisis, but they never ever mention the H-1B, the three letters. They never ever mention the rigorous and the terribly dehumanizing process of going to the visa processes. But on the other hand, you will see the Nigerians writing about it, the Ghanaians writing about it, many, many writers from Africa repeatedly critiquing that process. In an Indian English novel, you will not even see the mention of the name of the visa. I can tell you many names, and people will be offended. So I leave that to my class and academic essays.
I think I know which novel you're talking about.
But I'm saying that is what actually how it means to write fiction that serves the empire, because you are not naming them. You're not naming this dehumanizing process because it is making somebody, a white old lady in a book club, uncomfortable, you know, or somebody else, you know, somebody who is used to being at the center. So I wanted to resist that, and that's what I repeatedly went back to, circle back to go and center and embrace the aesthetics of the regional Indian novel. And I think the regional Indian novel is far more capacious, far more democratic, far more heterogeneous and heteroclassic.
I think I have a Goodreads review from Brad, which is should have said everything there was to say about it,
Brad.
But it was a whole rant about how this novel, first of all, not memoir, novel is in multiple languages and too many character names. I literally have them, like I have mother, father, grandmother, grandfather in just our language. How difficult. She should have provided a character list and a map. And I was like, Google Earth, go look. Why are we doing this labor? And that's what I mean by the Iron Dome, right? It's the sense of also then the entitlement of the knowledge comes to us, the novel comes to us. Yeah, in my job talk, I was told, why don't you have Roy and Rushdie on your presentation? And I said, because I didn't grow up reading them. Yeah. I read Manto and I read Ismat Chugtai. I didn't read these people. So, yeah. Anyhow, didn't mean to hijack that.
A quick sidebar to all the young people dating: do not date a Brad. Do not date a Brad. Second, another sidebar is that Aruni and I have an ongoing conversation about all the novels that we hate. And I'm sure my biggest thing is if we ever get hacked, the one chat I don't want leaked. That's why the moment he said visas, I'm like, I think I know exactly which novel this is about. So, all right. Now that we have the humor, we're going to go back into the more meaty things. Anjali, your new book, Ballot, is a deeply personal book. And I think you also mentioned organizing with all of these people, working with them, electing them, and then the silence, the refusal to engage. You're writing a book at the time of voting rights. Of course, the Supreme Court judgment has come. Of course, nobody foresaw it, but it's here. And so much is being dismantled in real time. So what did it cost to write this book? What is the price that, when I say the price that you paid, I'm not saying price as an individual, but a price as someone who is organized, someone who's been part of this movement. What does it mean at this moment for you to write this book?
You know, I think voting in a red state for many years in some ways prepared me a little bit for this moment, because when you live in a red state, your rights are always being compromised in many ways, right? For people in blue states, abortion became illegal for some of us under Dobbs, right? But abortion was only legal in name in many red states. There were so many barriers to get an abortion that we, you know, for especially low and middle income people, queer people, black people, other people of color, there was no real abortion access, right? If you have to drive 100 miles to get an abortion, but you can't get one on the first visit. You have to just go and get the ultrasound, and then you have to return within X amount of time. So then you have to take days off of work to do this. You don't have a right to an abortion, right? So I think having the perspective of really understanding whether we have rights, even when on paper it looks like we have rights, was a little bit of an advantage to me. So I am also a poll worker in Fulton County, which has been one of the most targeted counties in the United States by the Trump administration, right? So the practical, like seeing sort of on the ground what is happening, right? Before the 2024 election, our state election board, which is run by Trump loyalists, a 5-member board which is supposed to put into practice what our voting laws are. So literally, I'm in a chat with my poll manager and the people on our team because suddenly the rule is that we have to do a hand count of all of the ballots after we've closed the polls on election day, right? So in some ways, long before Louisiana v. Calais, which was just issued by the Supreme Court, which is dismantling Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, like we have been in a constant crisis. So in January, the FBI raided the Fulton County Elections Hub and stole my ballot from the 2020 election. Stole every ballot of every voter. There was a warrant by our corrupt DOJ, so technically it wasn't a theft. But every Fulton County voter, our ballots from the 2020 election are with the FBI, wherever they've put it, okay? So there is in some ways a helpful perspective when you are constantly living under this kind of suppression of rights, right? There is this constant, you're helping people fly out of Georgia to go get an abortion in another state, right? You don't expect to get to vote when you go to the polls. You expect to realize that your polling place has closed, in fact, and that the next one is a few miles away. You don't expect that the drop box you used to drop off your absentee ballot one year is going to be there the next year. You expect to be gerrymandered. So in 2018, I was part of a large group of residents in my districts, and we flipped 3 districts blue. We had been our state senate, our state representative, and our congressional seat. We flipped blue. It was this huge, huge victory. A few years later, we were gerrymandered red in 2 of those districts. 2 of those districts, in fact, I live in a very blue suburb of Atlanta, so it's not like it was, we are blue. We have majority Democratic voters. We were flipped so red that even though I'm a suburb of Atlanta, my congressional district goes so far north. The northernmost part is 10 miles from the southern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. Again, I'm a suburb of Atlanta, and I am in the same congressional district as people that live 10 miles from the Appalachian Trail in North Georgia. Okay? So there is a perspective and an understanding that much of the struggle that is apparent for some people only under a Trump administration has existed for some of us, and we've been fighting it for years. We were fighting it just as hard under Biden. We have to fight it under our Republican governors. We have to fight it under our my state senator, Sean Still, is an insurrectionist. On January 6th, he did not storm the Capitol. He was in D.C. ready to cast his fake elector ballot for Trump, okay? This is the everyday reality of living in a red state here. And I don't even remember what your question was, but I had a point.
It doesn't matter.
I had a point in there somewhere. Where, in some ways, there is a kind of knowledge and clarity that comes from being in a constant crisis of civil rights. And you have, out of that crisis, you have a substantial movement an ability and an awareness that nothing matters more than building coalitions, very diverse, wide coalitions with people, and being in with your community and working within your community, sometimes at the smallest, most local level. And I think that kind of awareness that we have under fascism and Trump and these horrible things, not to put it down, not to minimize it, but those crises are in other forms happening under every administration. One of my, and then I'll stop after this, I promise. One of my favorite writers is Dr. Thank you, love. One of my favorite writers is Dr. Carol Anderson, who is one of the foremost experts on voting rights in the United States. She's a professor at Emory. She wrote this brilliant book, I think it was published in 2019, called One Person, No Vote. I got to interview her for a few times. And she said something that I think, I tell this, what she says often, because I think it's really instructive. Before the passage of the Voting Rights Act, right, we had poll taxes where Black people had to pay to vote. We have literacy tests. We had all of these barriers. And she said, the problem with thinking about voting rights today is people think that those barriers disappeared. All they did was change forms. That's it. It's not a poll tax to vote is also exists when your precinct closes and you have to spend more money on gas or a bus fare to go further away to vote, right? Literacy tests, we don't technically have them today, but we do, because people who do not understand English as their first language, who do not have fluency needed to understand the ballot, have a literacy test every time they try to cast their ballots, because they can't read them in the language that it's given in. And we have states like ours who does everything possible to prevent from translating ballots into other languages, from having a translator at the polling place. So all of these rights are continuously being infringed upon, whether there is a robust Voting Rights Act or not. It's just a matter of changing our perspective and seeing the reality and the truth that exists beyond what our laws and policies actually state on their face.
Thank you for that, Anjali. And one of the things that I'm very grateful for your work is that I think in 2021, I think we had another conversation. And one of the things that you said was that, we think about crisis as if it just happens here and it's an exception. It's not. And I think that's kind of really, come to a point where we understand that we're constantly living in the state of crisis. This question is for all three panelists. I have two more questions, and I'm going to open it up because I can feel like all of our audiences are like here, and we're going to have a lot of questions. So I'm going to give them the time. So when you sit down to write, and this is for all three of you, who are you writing for? Are you writing for the people who already understand? Are you writing towards someone you don't know? But who are you writing for? It could be as meta, as philosophical, as funny as, who are you writing for?
You sent us these questions in advance.
They were, well, yeah. And they didn't prepare. Like, if I was their teacher, I would like...
Still within the syllabus.
I'm
It's
that
not out of
student who
syllabus.
comes in the end and says, what do you want me to write in the paper? Just tell me, I'll write it.
Does everyone know what out of syllabus is? It's a very Indian concept. Okay, fine. All right.
Suchitra sent us the syllabus a couple of days ago. So it's our duty to
She
prepare.
sent us the question paper.
Uh-huh.
And we
I
had
sent-
to
But she didn't
dream
give us
up
the
the
answers.
Apparently,
All the time. Wherever
Paper
we
chori.
go, we take,
the chori with us.
Do you want to go ahead?
No.
Okay, I'll go
yeah.
ahead. Yeah. I'm a storyteller. I'm a fiction writer. So for me, the best way I can make sense of the whole world when it doesn't make sense, when it makes sense, when I'm happy, when I'm not happy, is through stories. Stories always make sense to me. Writing them, reading them, engaging with them. So for a long time, this is a question that I think most writers who write in English in India has haunted, and it has led to very contentious cantankerous conferences and book festivals. And I saw this when I moved to Delhi in 2004 for the first time, and then I started attending a fest which eventually evolved into something called it was initially called a Nimrana Fest, eventually it became the Jaipur Fest, you know, and then we saw fest happening everywhere else. And this question became more and more vexed, and there are all kinds of op-eds written about it, people are writing books about it, people are earning PhDs about it, and writing dissertations. But I thought that this is a really question about the Indian English writer, and I don't want to be part of it. So for me, somewhere along the lines, I realized that I need to go back to my roots, which is the aesthetics of the vernacular novel that I keep talking about, because I did not want to be consumed by this debate. So for me, I realized that the Assamese novelists, the Hindi novelists, the Bengali novelists, and I read these three languages very well, they're not concerned about these things. They're not concerned about the audience. They think that the people who are able to read this book in this language will be able to read, but at the same time, they're happy if they have an extra reader sitting in Russia or Nagaland or Indonesia, you know? But they're not concerned by whether they are going to be understood by somebody who is sitting in Switzerland or London or New York, where the publishing centers of publishing is. So I really wanted to say the world, take me out of this debate. And I very consciously tried to walk out of this debate. But obviously, audience is there. I think audience, but reading Black American writers, especially the work of like a lot of Black poets like Nikki Giovanni, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, and also reading a lot of African Anglophone writers, it really taught me something very unique, that I realized that audience is still a specter, because Toni Morrison very famously wrote Invisible Man, but to who, right? Not to me. So, and I realized that I have to think about the idea of audience very deeply, both as an academic, as a writer who writes in two languages, and someone who teaches South Asian writing, post-colonial writing. So for me, I realized that audience is a specter that exists, that exerts a kind of influence how the text is going to be. But if I assume that the whole world is my audience, I would be writing water. It would be in the whole quest for universalism, I'd be writing something that is very flatline, that would kind of totally flatten the cultural, historical subtext, the granularities of the text, that richness that I see again in the vernacular novel. So I realized that the most artistically challenging and artistically rewarding thing for me was to actually stick to where I came from, you know, write for an audience who can read in this language, but write for an audience who can understand the specificity of my culture, but where I don't have to sit and explain anything, you know, and that explanation manifests in a variety of ways: self-orientalization, over-explanation, but also repeatedly assuming as a default that the reader is not Indian, but somebody sitting in New York. Mm-hmm. And that I wanted to do, not to do, and that's my audience.
So, in some ways, I only write for myself, and it just so happens that it becomes something that maybe other people might appreciate. Usually what happens is I take an interest in some kind of problem, and I start writing about it to find a solution. And what I end up realizing is that I am part of the problem. This happens in almost everything I write. My first book was an essay collection where I wanted to write about Southern identity as a daughter of an immigrant, as a brown person growing up in the 1980s, in a community where there were not many people. I was the first, in my elementary school, I was the first brown person that a lot of my classmates saw. So I was writing about white supremacy and race growing up in the South. During the 1980s, especially at the height of the AIDS epidemic, in the aftermath of the murder of Vincent Chin, a Chinese American in Detroit, Michigan, and understanding race in the US from the Southern brown girl perspective. And the essay collection is largely about my complicity in racism, which I didn't know when I started writing the book. I wasn't really, you know, I started writing the book almost with a victim mentality, and suddenly realized that I was actually the aggressor in a lot of ways, and reflecting on ways that, you know, not obviously, right, but in a sort of way where, you know, I am speaking out about racism, speaking out against it. I'm calling people out on it, but I'm doing it in a way that still really upholds white supremacy and U.S. imperialism. So that's what the book, it was me trying to understand something and then me realizing that I am the issue, right? And that actually followed through with my novel. And then this last book, it was trying to write about voting rights and understand it and try to make it voting more accessible, and realizing that a lot of my organizing not only didn't work, but it might have actually made things worse. And so I write for myself to figure something out, and then I realize that I'm the one that also needs to change.
Well, I've only written one book, so this is inspiring, though, for me to just sort of get this sort of longevity of career and this perspective. For me, when I was starting to really shape the book, there's this famous gender and women's studies professor, Gerda Lerner, who actually taught at UW-Madison, which is where I used to teach Hindi for very long. And she was a Holocaust survivor and then came to the US and really started gender and women's studies as women's history as a field in the US. And she used to tell the story of being a Jewish girl in Austria and how at the table the food would always be served to the boy first and then to her later. And she said this beautiful line that patriarchy at the dinner table is fascism in the streets. And that became such a sort of mantra for me because it really made sense of the world I was trying to depict and portray in this book. And yet, the eternal question of why should I write for this person sitting in New York or Chicago or wherever else? And in workshop, then, as I started showing pages, there was a friend of mine who's from Tennessee. And she took me aside and she said, "This sounds like my family." And so I think when you do go into parts of the Deep South or the Midwest, where this is still how families live, and this is still the sort of rot in the foundations of the structure that they're dealing with, suddenly why democracy is flailing makes sense. And you see the pattern. And so understanding that we were both just speaking from two different parts of the globe, at the same problem became really useful for me in framing how this book would even make sense to America as this sort of dual story of this is what it looks like to be in a family that's sort of, complicated on the inside, and there's a deep rot there somewhere. There's casteism, there's colorism, there's sexism, there's, all of this patriarchal nonsense that goes centuries back. There's wounds of the partition. There's, issues with neighbors. My grandmother hated that the neighbor upstairs would throw water from his mug down on her and it would hurt her head. It's just such a place where so many things are in tension with each other. And then in a place like that, when you bring in authoritarianism, it's already bubbling, it's there, and you're just sort of allowing for this fire to spread. So I think that interaction with my friend from Tennessee, the sense that as much as you want to be specific and choose that vernacular, you're also remembering that there are people they might not be able to write about it, but they're sharing very similar experiences. The next thing that I'm trying to write, pretending to write, I find it difficult, again, to get into it because, and I'm just brainstorming here now, this is just me throwing it out so I can think it out loud. But it's still in this sort of parallel of like the intimate systems and the big global systems that I'm constantly trying to look at. And I find that what we think of as extraction, right? When we say settler colonial extraction, capitalist extraction, whatever, neoliberal extraction, and there's a certain amount of extraction that has been done from Dalit and Muslim bodies and marginalized bodies in South Asia for centuries. And especially right now, it's heightened in a way that we are at a moment of reckoning in South Asia as well, right? But specifically in India. And so to be able to look back and remember that extraction is always twofold, that even within the marginalized, there is hierarchy, that we're always up against the one above us. And they're up against something else. I think that sort of complexity what does it do to the body? I'm very interested in that right now because I think, again, a lot of us watching the genocide live streamed have felt disembodied. And I think we have all felt unable to process pain and grief and just the visual trauma of it in the different parts. So for me, it's almost become like a somatic reaching of how do I tell the story about land, but also about a person, and especially the woman's body.
That's just a lot to process from all of you, but I had about 20 questions. I'm always an overachiever, and I'm very bad with time. But I am going to put one last question because I know that all of you have questions for our brilliant writers. I think this was one of those questions that I struggle with quite a bit, is for those of us writing about violence and dispossession, there is always this sense of need to perform a very particular kind of trauma. It is as if it's only the trauma, the violent porn that sells. So, as writers, are there times when you have refused it? Like, are there times when you said, no, I'm not doing this? Are there times in which you have yielded and said, you know what, maybe I should write this? So I really want to hear about this idea of trauma and dispossession and the demand from especially writers who are black and brown to perform a certain kind of trauma. Not that marginality or oppression or violence doesn't exist, but as if that is the only story that we can tell, right? So that's my last question to all of you, and then we'll open it up to our audience. Who wants to take it?
I mean, for me, it's like, when they arrested Mohsen Madawi and he walked out smiling, that's my approach to everything. I go to readings and I usually have the widest smile in the room. But it's the sense that we are here, we're alive, we're telling these stories because we're also filled with art and ability and talent and technique and craft and the power to kind of see it through, right? And we're going to bust into these places and we're going to tell these stories in the way that we would like to, for those that we want these books to exist for. So I think the reality cannot be, sort of beautified, and I did some of that in early drafts, even in my book, where I felt like I was trying to aesthetize what is just very real pain. And after a point, I was like, no, let the raw thing be there, and then think about what around it allows you relief. And so when you dig into what allows you relief, for me, it was my mother's painting, and just the way it was me dancing with my sister in the room in the night, closing the door. And so once you've, again, embodied that joy, then it's not performed. So I think recognizing that even grief, and this is where this East-West issue really bothers me, that in the West we have these ideas of like, oh, but, sadness or grief and too much is trauma porn, blah, 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 because the whole porn industry comes out of here, so it makes sense. But this sense that grief or violence cannot also be beautiful and aesthetically kind of a challenge that you work around as a writer, designer, or an artist, I fight that a little bit.
You know what, I'll start with an anecdote. So there's a word in Assamese which goes Tikafota Road, which means that it is terribly, terribly sunny and hot that day, okay? But it literally translates as like, it's so hot that your ass is cracking. Okay, then, but so in the mid-90s, when the counterinsurgency operations were happening, so the military used to go to these villages, and then they used to get lost because there was no Google GPS. So and this is a kind of a incident that became popular, or maybe it's an urban legend, or maybe it happened too many times. And on a very sunny day, they just stopped somebody and said, "Ye kya road hai? What road is this?" And the person answers, "Tikafota Road." So they actually looked at the map and looking for Tikafota Road everywhere because they had a physical map. And then he just like, and there's another story like that. Say his name was Pito. Pito means to beat me, but Pito is also a name. So then Pito was one day accosted by the army and asked questions. What is your name? He said, Pito. So usko pita thik se. So he was beaten up. So that's the joke or urban legend or something like this happened. But what I'm trying to say that despite the absolute horror of the counterinsurgency operations where there were women who were raped and they died at the end of it, like literally, and we read them on the first pages. But there are also people who were given electric shocks. One of my cousins had on their penises. But what at the same time, these things also existed. So what happens is that when you are writing a book, you have to think about how to actually write from a place of joy, but not necessarily of trauma only. And I realized this again and again, and I had learned this very beautifully and very effectively in my first book, because my first drafts, when I read all those Assam Human Rights Commission reports about the widespread secret killings that happened in Assam, extrajudicial killings, it was so horrifying. And I included a lot of those things because journalism literally failed us. And my first draft was very sort of full of these things that trying to fill up the gaps that journalism left behind. But then I took a step back and I said, the writers I admire actually are quite funny and ironic and beautiful. I need to take out all of this. So what I did was I put the violence on the backstage. So a lot of the violence doesn't happen on the page, but you see characters responding to that or reeling under it much later. There was a scene where a woman who is so scared to see army because she's a survivor of rape by the army, and she has lost the ability to speak after that event. She starts screaming and then peeing in fear, and then loses consciousness just because she sees an army soldier in front of her. And that was a real incident, But people talked about it both in wry ways and also sad ways. And so what I'm trying to say is that to write from but that exercise of revising the book really helped me, that I have to repeatedly foreground the perennial resistance of the common people, where there is joy, where there is hope, where there is delight, and not always write, ever, actually, not ever write from a position of disappointment.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I know it's been 13 years since I first read your book. There's one scene where I think this young man or woman just refuses to walk in the place, and they always go around, yes, because that was site of violence. Yes. Okay.
Yes,
I was
that's
right.
Yeah, there was somebody who was hung after their legs and hands were chopped off, and then when the police came and they took off the body fell in the middle of the road. So the children, they would walk around that. Yeah, and that because of years of doing that, the road actually had a curve. Otherwise, it was a straight road. And I did that as well myself.
Because I know this sounds terrible, but the first time I actually engaged with Assam, what happened in Assam was through Aruni's fiction. And I remember reading that draft, and I still very vividly remember that scene where there is no blood, there is no gore, but the way in which you describe it, I wasn't making this up. It did happen. Okay.
Thank you for remembering it after so many years. Yeah.
I don't know how much longer, but I'm happily in my middle ages now. But it's like, yeah. Anjali, sorry. Go on.
I think there is a tendency for a lot of writers, understandably speaking, to create stories of trauma that not only are sort of devoid of any kind of joy, as both of you mentioned, but also that have a redemption arc, right? Like there's always a happy ending to the trauma. So it's either there's a redemptive arc or there's a sort of a saviorism story going on, or even both. And I think I think part of learning how to write trauma is also teaching readers that there are real people, many real people in the world who walk around with completely unresolved trauma, with no redemption arc, who die in despair from it, who never heal from it, who never live a life of peace again. And being comfortable with that being a realistic, acceptable narrative that does not receive judgment from a reader. And so when I have written trauma, and I do a lot of what you do, Aruni, as well, is like I show it past the trauma, but I think you can write outside of the trauma and past the event of trauma, but in a way that is also not trying to sanitize it in any way, right? You're still writing very true to the story, and confronting the aftermath of it in a very accurate way, as you do in your books. And so I think writing against the tendency to feel that stories of trauma have a valuable lesson, because many times there is no lesson. It is just the trauma and people going about their lives the best way they can. Some being able to build a life from that, but some have lives that is constantly a subtraction of what follows in the trauma. And that kind of, that kind of storytelling to say, this is what it is, and there will actually be nothing beyond this. And that's okay, and that's acceptable too.
Now I'm going to open it up for our audience. Okay. I'm going to go from the back and come front. I'm going to take 2 questions at a time. I'll start with Kavita in the back, and then Anandita. So yeah, and then we'll take one here, and then we'll keep going back and forth.
Hi, so happy to see all of you here, some dear friends. As you all know, except I haven't met you yet, Zara, so I'm looking forward to doing that. But I write primarily in nonfiction, and I'm thinking a lot about how we actually use writing for change and for motivating people to confront the realities of authoritarianism. And all of you have kind of spoken to the realities of, how process is dehumanizing, how that has functioned in the United States as well as overseas, how you can have a right on paper but not necessarily be able to access it. In my work, I spend a lot of time thinking about how to document. In the past, I used to be kind of more of a traditional liberal and really believed in the power of institutions to kind of fill gaps that were rendered by social violence. And now, as time has gone on, I've come to see, especially in diasporic and immigrant communities, which we all are in some way, how these processes actually can entrench and amplify and reproduce ethnic cleansing and genocide and then globalize it in many ways. So I'm wondering, in these times, I'm finding more and more people are turning to fiction, to these intimate stories, and that speaks to Zara's speaking about the relationship between the intimate and the institutional and structural. But I also think it's important for people to tactically understand how these institutions function and how these processes work, and to be able to name how dehumanizing these systems are that we create in order to support asylum seekers. I'm thinking about the fact that after Modi came to power, asylum claims out of India rose by 998%. So here in the United States, we have this Indian identity that's very defined by kind of oppressor caste identity, by vegetarianism, by Brahmanism, by patriarchalism, and by meritocracy. But the community, as we see it, is now a receiving place for a lot of people who've experienced complex trauma and are, from historically oppressed communities there. India, despite being the 5th largest country in the world, economy in the world, is genuinely invisible here. So I'm wondering what the relationship, I want to ask specifically Suchitra and Anjali, but I would love to hear from our fiction writers as well, the relationship between kind of elucidating institutions and educating your reader versus connecting on an empathetic level, and how both can work together to kind of motivate people to confront, organize, and then change, not just around them, but within them.
Wow, that is a great, great question. Do you want to take this one first?
I'm going to get one more question. I'm going to just 2 questions at a time.
Answer both of them?
Forget the question.
Yeah, I hope I can remember.
I'll remember. Yeah.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay. Hi. I'm so excited to read your books. You guys were so passionate and such interesting perspectives. Zara, I read your book a month ago, and it was so beautiful and so moving, and I cried so many times. I think, so many beautiful things about it, but I think your relationship with your mom was one of my favorite parts of it. And so many scenes that stayed with me, you writing your Sanskrit board exam and all of that. But I think like when I first heard about it and as I was reading, I was just wondering like my first thought was like, is she okay? Like, how is she writing this book? And then I saw that you live in the US and I was like, oh, okay, that's why. So yeah, I know like the topic is writing in America, but I'm just curious if you think you could have written this book if you still lived in India and, you know, how the reception was with like publishers there and things like that.
We might have to censor that question. No, I'm being facetious. All right, the question about institutions, and then Zara will come to you.
So it's so interesting you asked that question, Kavita, because I have really changed my thinking on it. So I teach creative writing at a graduate level, and I also did my MFA several years ago. And you know, in literary writing, the enemy is being too straightforward, too didactic, telling, not showing. Right? There are these. There's this sensibility that in order to be beautiful and forceful writing, you need to be subtle and languid and flowery and you know, emotive, that you need to build worlds that educate the reader without without letting them know that you're educating them, right? Delivering information through art. And this is true of nonfiction, of course, too, right? Deliver education in an artistic way. But the problem with that is it's very hard to effectively fight propaganda artistically. You know, I am a fan of beautiful narrative nonfiction, of poetry, of fiction, of plays, movies. I think if your goal is education, sometimes you have to do it forcefully. Sometimes you have to say the way that you say it, and you have to be direct. And sometimes you can't be friendly. You can't be gentle. You cannot meet the audience where they are. In fact, you sometimes have to force it down their throats. And that is not something that any creative writing instructor would say. I do teach nonfiction, and I don't necessarily come out and say that. But on the other hand, I think sometimes we as writers feel that we need to be so precious and gentle with our words, and we are not convincing anybody of our points if we do that. In some cases, right? There might be other cases where we can. You know, I remember I read a review from years ago of Viet Thanh Nguyen's The Sympathizer, which is a novel that won the Pulitzer Prize a while back. And there was a critique about how sometimes the dialogue is too didactic. Sometimes he doesn't reveal a truth, but just speaks, the main character just speaks the truth. But sometimes that is where the greatest value is being as direct and clear and concise as possible. Because we are all on a timeline and we don't have time anymore. I love art. I would never argue against the creation of beautiful art and beautiful words, and I love writing fiction. But sometimes getting the point across has to have the greatest amount of value, not in the delivery. And, you know, in my own writing, sometimes I feel that waiting for a reader to learn and to understand and to come into their own defeats the purpose, because we're way too long in the crisis for the learning to take place, and we need to really just be very direct. Why don't you, Suchitra, why don't you answer that? Direct? No?
This is your day. And Kavita knows what I think about this. Zara.
Oh, this is about the... yeah, first of all, thank you so much for reading it and for feeling everything that you felt with it. Yes, I think when I started to really insert the layer of what it was like to be my mother's daughter, and then for my mother to be the woman she was within that house, I think everything that I said about that mantra, you know, of patriarchy at the dinner table and fascism in the streets, it started to feel very real. But honestly, even when I came to the US, and I came very recently, I was still this sort of, people walking around with unresolved trauma and not sure where they fit in these systems, and trying to write about an alcoholic father and a mother who's an artist who just doesn't have an outlet, and what does it mean to be the product of a broken marriage in what looks from the outside like an okay household, right? And it's only in the 2019-2020 CA and RC protests when they happened and Shaheen Bagh happened. And then I saw people who were the age that I was when 2002 happened, out on the streets and red in the face against this government, just so vocal about their sense of belonging, their sense of identity. And they had such a sort of, grasp on who they are and what their claim to democracy is, and they were not backing down, that really became a reminder to me that I used to be that person. And that in the act and the process of growing up, I made all of these negotiations with capitalism and reality and life and patriarchy that might have taken me away from who we are at the core. And so for me, like I said, that's why telling this very intimate story became the offering of like, here's what I bring to the table. The question of whether I would have written in India, I have a gazillion drafts still sitting in my Google Docs of things that I just, even when Modi was getting elected the first time in 2014, and I was married to a interesting person at the time who used to, in just casual gathering, kind of in his way of trying to show, listen, I'm like the liberal, Hindu person here. I'm going to tell everybody, she survived the Gujarat riot. Ask her. And I would never want to talk about, I didn't want the spotlight. I never wanted to have to explain this trauma porn of what has happened. And so I would write these angry, ranty drafts, and it was very direct. It was like, this is what happened. You just don't understand what it's like to live through that. And so I have these splotchy pieces that exist, but they weren't a book, because there's no practical real world in which any big publisher in India, especially today, will say, here, let me publish it. And when we went to India, I saw that happen. But I think it was the fact that I was here and I was watching what these kids, these young people were doing on the ground, which was so empowering, because it's not just about, oh, are you afraid of an administration? I am afraid of myself. And I'm extremely afraid of this material. I have run from it for 20 years. The only thing that would get my ass back in the seat was when I would see them on stage and I would see them giving these feisty speeches, them quoting, everybody from Kefi to like all these old revolutionary poets. And then to see the old women and the old men, the chachas with the daris and the topis sitting there and saying, nahi, the mulk hamara hai, like that, for me, was just energizing to remember that I come from a place of strength. I belong to a people of great defiance and great dignity, and how do I channel that back? So,
You'll come here. Questions from this side. Okay, I'll take both. Yeah. And then Tanya, and then we'll go again to this side.
My question to Aruni. It's very interesting that you brought this idea of borrowing vernacular aesthetics. But then when you talk about vernacular aesthetics, I was reminded of my own Nepali language canon, right? And that canon is made by Brahmin males. The whole aesthetics is all about Brahmin males writing their own stories. And at one point of time, a woman writer came in and said that everything I read about Nepali literature is wrong. So how do you navigate that and then bring in the, this vernacular aesthetics? Thank you.
Yeah.
Aruni, I'm just going to take one more question.
Sorry, yes.
Okay. So everyone has said such beautiful things that I'm trying to process, and I've compiled all of my various thoughts in sort of one thing to ask. So we've spoken and heard a lot about memory and identity and the need, to some extent, of preservation of all of this. So this is sort of to everyone, but Anjali, I'm from Memphis, Tennessee. I grew up there, but parents are from India, and a lot of my work focuses back in India, even though I was raised here. Right now, as we've spoken, people are witnessing this authoritarianism when, for folks in the South, has been this constant crisis, this reality. And I'm wondering how, as we're all speaking about complex identities, how do you confront this complex identity in this moment and learning from international movements? Because I think at a larger scale in the US, I don't know if we're angry enough. And I feel like when I hear from international movements, I don't think we're necessarily doing enough. And I think part of it is to your point of being direct, but I think, so that's one, I guess, sub-question, and then on the identity. And the other sort of point or question is to Zara, to you, and also to Aruni. This is a little bit what you write about in terms of like familial trauma and memory. So only recently my mom explained to me that she went through the 1984 in Delhi's Fatehnagar. And only recently I found out that my grandparents were on the trains during partition. So that's something I recently found out. It's been something that's so suppressed, but as you noted, it comes out in small ways in the everyday. And so I think the fear that parent or immigrant parents have when they come to the US for their own daughters and sons to be part of this fight against what's happening right now is a constant negotiation. And I was just curious about what folks thought about that. And then I think on this point, Aruni, what you mentioned about having foregrounding joy and not having to display the trauma. There's a wonderful movie by Elia Suleiman on It Must Be Heaven, where people expect, it's kind of silent, but people sort of expect that because he's Palestinian, all his work will be on the trauma that Palestinians go through. And he consistently gets rejected from people publishing his script because it's not that. So anyways.
Aruni, do you want to take the question and then we'll go to Anjali?
I don't know. Actually, I've not read much of Nepali literature, so that must be true. And on the other hand, the Assamese literature I grew up reading was far more polyphonic. It was not simply written by upper caste. Even the books written by upper caste really held space for a lot of issues about caste violence and etc. That's one thing. The caste story in Assam is very different than the caste story in southern India or northern India, which is the reason also we don't probably have a similar kind of movements in Assam, because it is a much more tribal society. 60-70% of the people are tribal, and rest of them are claiming to be tribal. Some are actually removed of tribal status because it doesn't help the electoral policies and so on and so forth. It's a very, very, I would say, in the indigenous society. It's very, even the people who are converts to Christianity, or even people who are in so-called general caste, they're usually originally tribals. I come from a tribe called Kusrajbangsi. We were given tribal status, then it was taken away, and so on and so forth. So that's one thing. The other thing is also the vernacular aesthetics doesn't also have to be written. It is also very much in the folk songs, in the wedding songs, in the storytelling traditions. We have something called, there's one question, I talk about this when I talk about my poetry collection in an interview in the magazine Catapult, that I drew so much from the storytelling traditions of Assam, especially Thionam. Thionam is a form of art that actually one person tells the story, but they would tell the story by acting out 30 to 40 characters overnight, and everybody would sit around and we would listen to them. Then the questioner was asking me, how are you writing other characters who are not your experience, like women or children, or and I said that because in a vernacular writing tradition, in indigenous writing aesthetic, it is the triumph is in actually to be able to write from different kinds of perspectives. But the American neoliberal identity politics actually makes it very vexed, and it's a very deflating way of approaching literary imagination. So I think the literary imagination in the vernacular is Brahmin or upper caste or patriarchal, probably mostly in the written, but not necessarily in the oral. They're also in the songs. I mean, songs of Bhupena Jarika or Zubin Garg, all of these are very, very important parts of our imagination. There's a reason why there were 500,000 people processing when Bhupen Hazarika passed away. And then we have seen the same thing, because they are so much part of our everyday life. Somebody would say one line of Jyoti Prasad Agarwala, another singer, and everybody would know the whole repertoire of work that they are referring to and how it resonates across multiple poems and literature. And also, so there are various ways in the vernacular aesthetics actually exist. It's not just in different, also it's different languages, the aesthetic is very, very different as well. Yeah, regarding the trauma thing, should I? Yeah, okay. Actually that happened to me when I was young. I was in Delhi University studying, and I was writing from a very young age. The editors would ask me work, and they would say, but it's not about insurgency. But the funny thing is that I was writing an Assamese short story, so sometimes I would just rewrite the same short story that is already published and has a readership into English. And I really try to talk about that in my story collection, The Way You Want to Be Loved, which is generously my publisher G has published, Gaudy Boy, and where basically an Assamese writer goes to read in a Delhi conference. And when he reads a story about, which is a retelling of a folktale called Tejimola folktale, everybody asks him, why are you not writing about the insurgency? You are not socially responsible, blah, blah, blah. But that is something that really happened to me. And for me, it was very puzzling because, again, I come to the space of Indian English writing as an Assamese writer, wrote in Assamese, who went to Assamese literary conventions and conferences. But to see that certain thing was expected from me as a fiction writer by the rest of the mainland was very puzzling and very, very upsetting to me. But at the same time, I didn't want to perform to that. I wrote what I wanted to write.
Yes, so great to meet another Tennessean here. So, Memphis, in case people don't know, Memphis was one of the major centers of the civil rights movement in the Deep South, along with Selma, Alabama, and Atlanta, and of course several other cities. Very recently, just days ago, the Tennessee legislature redrew the only black majority district in Tennessee, which is Memphis, predominantly Memphis, into the other 3 other congressional districts, and to disenfranchise the votes of black people, primarily in Memphis. And so this has been a very sobering thing to happen there. But to mention about protest, which I think is important. I was born and raised in the United States, and I do not know if this is common in other countries, but in the US we have an extremely fictionalized and sanitized idea of what protest is and what actually happens during protest. There has been no social movement in the history of the world that has not succeeded due to some kind of violence. Nonviolent protest is a bit of an oxymoron. Certainly, the actions of nonviolent protest achieve results, but it has always almost been accompanied by violence, rebellions, resistance movements, which involve extensive loss of life. And everything from the Quit India movement, which we see the images of Gandhi and people marching peacefully, and the civil rights movement in the US, has involved riots that threatened the lives of the ruling class. And it is those acts of violence which have oftentimes been the impetus, along with nonviolent movements, for change. The British left India because, one, they were broke after World War II. And yes, they saw the marchers, and the marchers were very effective, but also they were scared out of their minds that they were going to be killed in some of these riots, right? And so you really cannot have one without the other. We see happening here in the United States, we call protests that we see protests when really they're parades. Nothing against people that have organized these parades. I have organized many parades that look like protests, standing on the streets with signs and chanting, and they're wonderful, and they're community building, and they are a necessary part of the process. But it is not a resistance movement. It is not taking risk. It is not sacrificing the health and safety of our communities in order to engage in that risk. And it is not threatening in any way, shape, or form. So I think part of the problems of that we were not able to achieve when Trump was first elected in 2016, I mean, we had people knitting pussy hats as a sign of protest. If there is not a direct threat on the ruling class, please don't post this on social media that I said this. If there is not a direct threat to the safety of people in the ruling class, we are not really going to achieve liberation, right? We can pretend that we can read books about liberation and that we can, march and hold hands and we can, and again, I do this. I hold signs and I march with people, and certainly it's connected me. It's brought the joy of resistance. That's important. Connecting with your community members, building relationships, sharing love with one another, creating safe spaces for one another. These are all essential to liberation movements. But if that's all we're going to do, we are getting nowhere. And I think in the US especially, we are brainwashed from a very young age that people dumping tea into the harbor in Boston, and then suddenly the U.S. is independent, right? Suddenly there is the United States, right? We have these stories that we tell each other about how we achieve social change, and they're very often just sort of the most superficial stories that it's almost mythology about how these movements actually are effective. And it involves a loss of life. It involves property damage, and it certainly involves people acting in ways that make the ruling class afraid. And I think for whatever reason, these false narratives about how we achieve change sort of override people's thinking, and they feel that they are doing the work, but they're not actually doing the work. And I think we living here in this country now need to do what we can to sort of reckon with this and sort of share alternative ways. We're running out of time very quickly, right? We are doing what we can. And I don't, which is not to say that other ways don't work, right? Boycott can be so incredibly effective. Minnesotans very recently created their own government to fight ICE. I mean, they came together and they built beautiful things, and these beautiful things are really important. But have the detentions and the deportations slowed down? No, not one bit. In fact, they've just ramped up, but they're just being done more quietly. So we have to find a way to be open-minded and educate ourselves about the true histories of how people liberated themselves, which doesn't look pretty a lot of the times.
Anjali, I just want to say that everything you said has already been tweeted, and you've been tagged on Twitter.
Thank you, with the photo and my home address.
We're also going to be doxing you. Okay, we're running out of time, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the last round of questions, and then we are going to close up. I will take a question from there, and...
Hello, hi. Am I audible? Oh, yeah. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that. Hi, this was a very inspiring talk. I have been following your work. I wanted to take a leaf out of what Anjali was saying earlier about recognizing work that you've done around organizing and writing, and recognizing that often you were the aggressor. And I just was curious about, and anyone can take this question, of course, about what it is to write often as an aggressor yourself, and what it is to write for the aggressor too, right? Like, what it is right for when you recognize that you might be in the oppressor side of things, and to write for other oppressors. And this is where I might annoy Arunita a little bit maybe. And as an Assamese myself, like, the contemporary story of Assam is no longer the story of like insurgency, like I'm talking about right now. It is, I think the fundamental question right now for me as an Assamese is what is happening to Bengali Muslims, right? And the fact that as a Hindu Assamese man, how do I look at that, and how do I like write about? And as much as we talk about like, empire here, and how do we challenge and how do we resist the empire, and what we see and what I've seen as a someone who has moved to the United States fairly recently, the abject absence of the ruling, or let's say white Americans, or like mainstream media, mainstream writers, lack of kind of perspective about what is happening, or just lethargy, I guess, to understand what is actually happening. And it often makes me wonder, are we doing the same thing, right? As Hindu people, like from in India, and as like Assamese Hindu, like and maybe like just about what is right to like politically conscious writing as an oppressor. Yeah.
Salil, I'll just take a question from Salil and then Madhuri, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, very quick question, because all of you are in classrooms. So this is about that, and because of what you said about Anjali and tweeting, and that's why. What do you feel when you're in a classroom with Turning Point and all these movements in America? If someone is taping you, if someone is going to tweet and quote you out of context, are you watching your words in the classroom because of this is not just about the white American audience, but even the Hindu nationalists who are also all over the campus now, who might be listening to something to distort it completely and then get some rich donor coming and saying that, take away this person's tenure or to take them out of the tenure track.
Can I please take that question? Because I was teaching a whole classroom full of Hindu Americans. I was teaching them Hindi. And I'm sorry I'm jumping into this second question, but I need to say this before I forget. First year that I did that job, I think second semester or something, we were in the very beginner levels of, just asking somebody the kind of yes, no question. Are you Indian? Are you Chinese? Are you American? How do you say, the negative or the positive of it? And so we were trying it out as, fun and looking at somebody saying, kya aap Chini hai? Kya aap Japani hai? Kya aap whatever hai? And everybody, has to say no and say, nahi, main Hindustani hu. And then this Gujarati girl, Hindu, turns and looks at me, and she has, for some reason, made this assumption, and she says, kya aap Pakistani hai? And now anybody who has lived in an Indian Muslim body knows the inherent violence that even if she didn't mean it, she might have come completely out of the blue with it. Maybe she literally thinks for some reason that I am from Pakistan. And this is the other thing. A lot of people who are raised here as Hindu American don't even recognize that these other cultures exist in India. They're not taught that sometimes at home. And so I had to go through this whole my life flashing in front of my eyes saying, okay, I can say this, I can say that, and I can have all these reactions. And then I was like, you know what, this is a teaching moment. And so I just looked at her and I said, hum sab mein se sirf main Hindustani hu. Because they all have American passports. And so the sirf got taught in that sentence. But so this is all to say that a lot of us right now, especially in this moment, are terrified of the sort of censorship and academic freedoms that are under threat, right? And Iowa is notorious. Even when I was there as a grad student, my friend was a TA who had to quit and move states because she got doxxed and she ended up on Fox News. So for me to go back there and teach at this point, I am very clear. And I make a joke about this, that when I leave my more sort of progressive blue bubble of Madison, Wisconsin, and I travel to Iowa, I'm just entering this Jane Austen novel in which the whole world is white and it's all colonial and lovely, and you're still going to smell flowers and read your nice literary novels where nothing, the villains are obscure. And then I will do some real work with my students, but that's not where my work is sometimes. Often, just my presence is the work. So me standing there and saying, Sirf main Hindustani hu to that kid in a Hindi classroom, or to be there and say, you know what, this is what it is like to be from India, to embody these different cultures, to speak in these different languages, to be able to tell these stories of ecological harm and socio-political harm. That in itself is the work. But my real concrete, more sort of direct work happens on the streets at home.
Yeah. And then we can finish up. Yeah.
Hello? Yeah. Thank you, everyone. This was really moving, illuminating, wonderful conversation, and I'm so glad I could bear witness to it. My question is a little bit about, so I'm going to sound cynical, but in this era of, publishing sort of going the way of big pharma and very young writers having to sell their trauma stories to the highest bidder and extreme gatekeeping and books are products. How do you feel about the future of storytelling in the US? And what would your advice be to young writers who are embarking on a sort of career of writing or wanting to become career storytellers? And relatedly, I'd love to know who some of the contemporary writers are that you've read that have just blown your mind and given you some sort of hope about the future of storytelling.
So a little bit of curation. Aruni, do you want to take the question? And then the last question, I want all of you to answer Madhuri's question. And then we'll finish with a love list of all the writers that we like.
I'll start with Biplab's question because your question was like, what do you do as a Hindu, Assamese person in this context, right? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think my problems and my way of approaching everything is through literature. So I'm very aware of the limitations as well as the power of that space. And I have become, from a very sort of young age, I realized that I have to know my space very well, and I have to think about literary problems as a solution. Now, I believe that fiction or literature are not spaces that have to speak to always to immediate realities. It is also a very challenging thing to do, even though my work in the racist book is about immediate realities. It's about living under Modi's regime after 2014, what happened, what it meant to be a queer person, what it meant to go on Grindr and date in Delhi and fall into trouble, and all of that. So it was very much about Modi's and immediate Modi years, my new novel that is coming out. But I think one of the ways we can engage with how the minorities in Assam are suppressed and tortured is by, for me, has been to translate writers from Muslims of Bengal origin, right? So the East Bengali people, like writers such as Abdus Samad, Kulsum Bibi. Thank you, I'll take it. Yeah. Thank you very much. I'll drink it. So, because Suchitra brought it. So I think one of my way of engaging that has been to translate these writers, like Abdus Samad, or repeatedly write about them in Assamese as well, Kulsum Bibi, or and talk about it and foreground it, because Assamese mainstream literary society actually repeatedly suppresses their voices. It has been seen also in my work of anthologizing, where I'm in my anthology, for the first time ever, there are so many anthologies of short stories from Assam, but in the anthology that I edited, How to Tell the Story of an Insurgency, for the first time ever, there are Assamese writers who claim Assamese identity, but they wrote in other languages. But otherwise, the only way people used to categorize an Assamese writer was if they wrote in Assamese. So I included writers who wrote in Boro, writers who are from the immigrant Muslim community from erstwhile Bangladesh, writers who wrote in Bengali, writers who wrote in Hindi as well. So I think those are the ways for me to resist. But you, as a journalist, will do it differently. Somebody who is working as a farmers organization leader will do it differently. But each of us will have to do the job very, very well. And some of those jobs will have immediate results, tasks, and some of those will have very long-term results. The results will come probably not now, much, much later. And I'm okay with that because there is a space also for what it means to live, the innocence of life, the luxury of just sitting on a day, depending on what in a specific time, the small joys of life. Those are also real, and we have to document that as well. And maybe that's a job of the fiction writer often.
So the final question: what do you think of the writers, the future? Yeah, and then your love list of fiction writers that you like, that you are blown away by. Okay. Madhuri's question.
What do I think about the publishing? Yeah, I think there is what I see in comparison to to India or South Asia is that I'm talking about Anglophone publishing only at this point, is that there is a wide range of, there is a spectacular diversity of independent publishers doing very good work, university publishers doing good work. In the last 10 years, I have seen university publishers publishing a lot of so-called trade books, in whatever flawed ways they do it, but do it very well. They're bringing out urgent works. The balance sheets are not the only deciding factor. They're not saying if you can't ensure 40 people in your audience will never do a book launch, which I've been told. So things like that, the rules that decide what a corporate publisher would do. So I think that is one hopeful way of looking at it. The other thing is that I think the whole point of the collaboration of academia and creative writing has some benefits as well. And I see those benefits as the fact that I have tenure, whatever it means in Georgia. But I have tenure, which means that I can do aesthetically adventurous work that probably will not be always accepted by a corporate publisher. And at the same time, I'm someone who also would probably do more hackneyed work because I want to be published by a big publisher. But I'm okay with both. I'm happy to write a thriller when I need to, but I think that tenure really gives me that space and ability and the freedom to be able to think in a variety of ways. And that's why I think that those are spaces which have possibilities, and I see the future in that as well. Most of my graduate students, PhD students who come from incredibly prestigious creative writing programs to do PhD at University of Georgia, they have a distrust for the corporate publishing world, and they are very delighted to be published by small presses and independent presses, and they actually consciously pursue those. So there is that space as well. It's very, because the corporate publishing world dominates the conversation, it's very hard to see that there are so many new plants being sowed elsewhere as well, and they actually outnumber the corporate publishing world. List of writers. Yeah, I really loved Kin by Terry Jones. I would recommend that very highly. And who else? I would recommend Anjali's book, Ballot. I loved it very much. Zara's book is amazing as well. I'm looking forward to read Marlon James' new book. And there's a very good book that will be published in July called How to Date a Fanatic.
I'm definitely going to read that one. So, it's interesting. I love the question about publishing, because I think it's very much also related to the other questions about sort of activism and being the aggressor, and which is that you have to find the most honest path forward, because almost every path has some kind of dishonesty involved in it, and be happy at the end game of what you were able to achieve under certain limited circumstances. I published 3 books. 2 of them are, one is a university press, University of Georgia. The other one is the university press imprint of a larger publisher, Bloomsbury, and then the other publisher is an independent mid-sized press. And it took me many, many years of submitting many books to get my first book contract. I think I had like 12 or 14 years of rejections, and I was never able to get a literary agent, sign with a literary agent who could actually sell any of my books. So I had to go around, right? I had to go around. And the result was that I was paid very poorly, but I ended up with a product that would have likely been compromised in some way had I been with a large corporate publisher, and was able to produce the kind of book that that I wanted. Now, I don't want to romanticize the fact that I was barely paid at all, because certainly that says a lot about privilege, and that I didn't have to make so much money from any of these books. And so it's still I'm still part of the system that reinforces the harm in publishing, right? I wasn't able to exempt myself in any way, and I found a way through because I had the privilege to find the way through. But I think it's I think one of the things I tell people, generally speaking, is that some of the best writing that you'll find as a reader are books that are in translation and books that are published by small presses. I think those are, and of course, most books in translation are published by small presses, right? So I think it is a great place to look for authentic voices that sort of challenge traditional parent publishing narratives. And I also read Kin recently by Tayari Jones, which is fantastic. And I will just highlight one other book, which is, I don't know how to pronounce the first name of the writer. Last name is Felix. It's called Let the Poets Govern. It is a nonfiction book about activism. Felix is a wonderful poet, but she was also a speechwriter for several candidates and elected officials, and she was also I can't remember what her title was for Elizabeth Warren's presidential campaign in 2020, but she was like communications director. And so but on the other hand, she's deconstructionist. She wants radical change. She wants to burn the system down. So it was this wonderful narrative of working inside the system and now working outside of the system and talking about the cost and the toll of what we sacrifice about ourselves, what we sacrifice about larger movements by working within something and inherently supporting it. So it gave me a lot to think about.
I always blank out when I'm asked about this. Sorry, I just remember two titles. I would highly recommend Fearless, which is by Tracy K. Smith. It's a beautiful nonfiction book about how poetry can be a tool of surviving the current reality. I would recommend Choice by Neil Mukherjee. Wonderful book. It's like actually a very stringent critique on publishing itself. So you would really like it because it's you're asking about publishing.
So thank you for taking that. Never. Clearly, I was not a good student. I have really enjoyed, funnily, reading Old White Women because I'm just amazed at the sort of verve with which they walk into a room, right, of any kind of character and like take it on and sort of write it in this way. And so for me, it's been more an exercise of like, how is she doing it? And what in these systems is allowing her to do it? And so what has trapped me and what is the way that I negotiate with it? So I can, because the goal is always good writing. It's not about, how do I make the justification for why I couldn't do it? And so I've just been really into sort of 90s, like the big names, Anne Patchett and Annie Proulx and some of those ladies. Because they were writing, again, this sort of intimacy of the violence of the American project. Sometimes I think not knowing that that's what they were doing, but they painted such lucid, beautiful pictures which became the sort of soul and the anthem of the country, right? So when literature works like that, I think it behooves us to ask why and what about it is doing that. But in contemporary work, I was completely blown away by Isabella Hamad's Enter Ghost when I came across it. And then Danez Smith's poetry and Lina Khalif Tufaha's poetry and oh my God, and I'm reading this novel right now by one of my favorite memoirists, Takira Madden, who's Hawaiian, Floridan queer writer. And again, it's about like predatory, like the system of CSA, of child sexual abuse, and the sort of judicial incarceration system, how it fails survivors. But when I say it like that, nobody's going to buy it. But the way she has rendered it, it's the art and in the way that it's been rendered. So yeah, anybody who wants a longer list, I'm happy to send you some.
We can actually compile a list and send it out to all of our readers. So we'll do that. That brings us to the end of this conversation. So I have a couple of things that I want to tell you, so please stay on. We want to continue doing these events, which means that the reason we do this is because we have a community of readers and writers and thinkers, and people want to be a part of it. So subscribe to our newsletter so that you hear about our events. Second, Polis continues to become independent. We need to be supported by our readers. So if any of the work that we do appeals to you, consider making a donation, whether it is $5, $50. If you have a trust fund, you could also talk to me about QSPS, and I can tell you how to figure that out. We also take crypto. I just set up a crypto account, so I'll take crypto too. So yes, please do consider supporting the work. I do want to give out a quick shout out to our other friends in the room. We have G, who runs Singapore Unbound, who also does incredible work bringing together writers. So those are also organizations I hope you will support. We have Kavita Rajagopalan from the Center for Community Media. Kavita has been single-handedly bringing together smaller community media, not only in New York, but across, but also another brilliant writer who wrote Muslim in the Metropolis many years ago, and I stalked her, and I forced her to become friends with me. So this audience is also full of some incredible people doing great work, so I hope you also get to know each other. And again, I hope all of you have a great summer. And for those of you who joined later, our brilliant culture editor, Madhuri Shastri, is here. You could pitch her directly if you're a writer, and then you have my permission to harass her. Our writers are going to be here for another 5 minutes, but then we're also about to close this place out. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope you keep coming for more events. Thank you.
Thank you, Suchitra.